Determinism says that the state of the world at any given time is fully and completely necessitated or guaranteed by the state of the world at the prior time, together with the laws of nature. One thing that determinism implies is that you can iterate the process of determination from one moment to the next. So, for example, let's take a arbitrary moment in time 65 million years ago, and let's consider the state of the world at that time. Call that state of the world S. Of course, we don't know all the details of S, but there was such a state of the world at that moment because that is just a description or list of all of the things happening at that time. There were things happening at that time. Call the collection of those things S. And then let's add to that the laws of nature. If determinism is true, then there was only one possible future state of the world, call that S1, at the next moment in time. If our first state of the world S included a dinosaur, a brontosaurus, approaching a tree, perhaps the next state of the world S1 involved that same brontosaurus slightly closer to the tree. I mean, we don't know exactly what was in S or in S1, but this is the sort of thing that determinism implies, whatever the details of that state of the world at that time were. So if determinism is true, then you can wind back the clock, so to speak, and start with S and add the same laws of nature. And what determinism says is there's only one possible output, so to speak. Every single time you rewind and press play, the story of the world will come out precisely the same way, with that brontosaurus getting a little closer, together with all the other changes that are happening in the rest of the state of the world. You can iterate this process, as I mentioned, so that at the next moment, when you add the laws of nature to state of the world S1, there is, according to determinism, only one possible state of the world at the next moment. Call that state of the world S2. Imagine that that's a state in which the brontosaurus has just passed the tree. And every single time you rewind and press play on the sort of, so to speak, story of the world, there is just one possible future consistent with the state of the world at S1 and the laws of nature at that time. Eventually, if you keep iterating this process, you will eventually get to, a few months ago when you were considering whether or not to take Philosophy 2010. There was a particular moment, let's say, when you decided to press the button to register on registration day. Let's call the state of the world on registration day that includes your deciding whether or not to take that class SN, where N is just some arbitrary number, very long number, many, 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 many moments from 65 million years ago. If determinism is true, then there is, after SN, the state of the world SN, that includes you deciding whether or not to go to take philosophy class, add to that the laws of nature, there was only one possible future, namely one in which you chose to take Philosophy 2010, and here you are taking it at SN, and that's going to be the state of the world SN plus 1. Again, if we rewind things according to determinism and skip over each of the steps, determinism says that every possible replay of the long tape of the world that starts with the dinosaur approaching the tree 65 million years ago will eventually result in exactly the same state of the world now, that is in the year 2024 as I'm recording this, that involves a state of the world where you are taking Philosophy 2010. No matter how many times you press rewind and play, things will end up precisely the same way. In that sense, if determinism is true, then you taking Philosophy 2010 was guaranteed by the state of the world in the distant, distant past, where the dinosaurs were roaming the earth. You weren't there, no one else you know was there, together with the laws of nature. It was, in some sense, fated or guaranteed that you would, given that the state of the world was that way 65 million years ago, you would indeed take Philosophy 2010. Incompatibilism is the thesis that if determinism is indeed true, then we have no free will. So it's important that incompatibilism is a conditional thesis. Incompatibilists don't, just as incompatibilists say determinism is true. All the incompatibilist says is, hey, look, if it were the case that everything I do is guaranteed by some state of the world in the distant past, then I have no free will, and neither do you. In, Incompatibilism is intuitively appealing, in the sense that when I first present the problem of free will to people, this is not just my experience, but this is the experience of most philosophy professors. When people first encounter this problem, they're like, of course, incompatibilism is true. I mean, it's almost true by definition, that determinism, if everything I do is guaranteed by the distant past and the laws of nature, then I can't be free. The trouble, though, as we got into briefly in the last video on determinism, is that um, you know that immediate reaction often is based on a conflation of determinism and fatalism. And so it may well be that determinism is incompatible with free will, but I think what we need is an argument for that claim that states determinism correctly, doesn't conflate it with fatalism, and argues from the assumption that determinism is true to the conclusion that we have no free will. Enter Peter Van Inwagen, who has given perhaps the most influential argument for incompatibilism in originally his book in the early 80s, an essay on free will. Peter Van Inwagen is a professor at the University of Notre Dame. He's one of the most influential living philosophers, and certainly, I think, among the most influential metaphysicians of the last 100 years or so. Van Inwagen gives us an argument for the conclusion that if determinism is true, then no one's ever free. And part of the power of his argument is it is a regimentation and a precisification of our natural reaction. So, to the extent that you reacted to determinism with the sense of like, boy, if that were true, then no one's free. Then I have no free will. It's an illusion. Van Inwagen says, I agree with you, and I can make your reaction more precise. I can turn that into an argument. Here's a statement from an essay on free will, a really compressed statement of the argument that Van Inwagen gives. If determinism is true, then our acts are the consequences of the laws of nature and events in the remote past. But it is not up to us what went on before we were born, and neither is it up to us what the laws of nature are. Therefore, the consequences of these things, including our present acts, are not up to us. So this argument has come to be known as the consequence argument, because basically Van Inwagen is going to argue that if we have no control over or no ability to change certain events, and those events have as a consequence our present decisions, then it follows that we have no power and have never had the power to control or change our present decisions. Van Inwagen's strategy is going to be to assume, for the sake of argument, that determinism is true. It's really important that his ultimate goal is to defend that conditional claim, that if determinism is true, then we have no free will. So in beginning with this assumption of determinism's truth, Van Inwagen is simply provisionally granting that for the purpose of deducing from that assumption the conclusion that we have no free will. Once he has made that deduction, he will then discharge the assumption that determinism is true and say, what I've proven is, on the assumption that determinism is true, it may or may not be, but if it were, then we have no free will. So he is going to, and the way we'll set this up is the first premise of the consequence argument begins by assuming determinism for the sake of argument, and the conclusion takes some arbitrary action or decision of yours. I invite you to put it in the first person, and says, therefore, that action or that choice was not free. So let's take your action of taking philosophy 2010. The conclusion of our consequence argument is, therefore, I'm not taking philosophy 2010 of my own free will. That action of mine, which I might have thought was the sort of thing I was when I made the decision free, is not actually free. How, though, are we going to fill in the details here from the assumption of determinism's truth to the conclusion that this arbitrary action of mine, taking philosophy 2010, isn't a free one? Well, here Van Inwagen says it's going to be useful to have in hand a definition, and that is this idea of an unalterable fact. In the piece I had you guys read, which includes a compressed and more accessible version of the consequence argument, he calls these untouchable facts. I'm going to call these unalterable just because untouchable sounds a little weird to me. Unalterable facts, I think, captures it a bit better. An unalterable fact is a fact that no human being in history could have ever done anything to change. An unalterable fact is a fact that no human being in history could have ever done anything to change. There are all sorts of facts that obviously some people don't have the power to change. But an unalterable fact is even stronger. It's a fact that no one now has ever had the ability to change, nor has any human in history had the ability to change. So, for example, he gives us these examples. That the Earth is roughly spherical is a geographical fact that no one in history has ever had the power to make different. That is, to make the Earth not roughly spherical. It's not something in our control. The fact that iron is magnetic, that's not something that any human being has ever had the power to change. Perhaps we could alter some of the physical makeup of certain pieces of iron, but if we did so, and did so to such an extent that those bits of iron were no longer magnetic, then they wouldn't be iron anymore. So it's the sort of thing that we have no power to change. Here's a historical fact. Dinosaurs existed in 65 million BCE. That's a fact that, barring time travel, none of us can ever change. Importantly, there are unalterable facts that are conditional facts. So, for example, if a number is lower than 5 or lesser than 5, then it's lesser than 6. That is a conditional fact. It's an if-then. But that's also the sort of thing that is unalterable, in the sense that the fact that a number's being less than 5 guarantees it's being less than 6 is the sort of thing that human beings have no power to change. We could change our language if we wanted, but that wouldn't be changing the underlying mathematical fact there. Here's another one. If methane is combined with oxide, then combustion occurs. There's another if-then that involves a causal process over which we have no control. Okay, so we have this notion of an unalterable or untouchable fact. Why is this relevant to the consequence argument, and how does this fit in? Well, Van Inwagen says this: the notion of an untouchable or unalterable fact has a certain logic to it. One of the principles of this logic is, or so it seems, embodied in the following thesis, which I shall refer to simply as the principle. And here's the principle. Suppose it's an untouchable fact that P, and suppose also that the following conditional or if-then statement expresses an untouchable fact. If P, then Q. It follows from these two suppositions that it's an untouchable fact that Q. Okay, what's going on here? The P's and Q's are sentence variables, so you could take any complete sentence and swap them out for P and Q. I'm going to give you a formulation of what he's calling the principle, and I'm going to call it the unalterability principle, so that we're clear what the principle's about. Here's the principle, or the unalterability principle. If it's an untouchable fact or unalterable fact that P, and it's an unalterable fact that Q is a necessary consequence of P, then it's also an unalterable fact that Q. Let me read that again. If it's an unalterable fact that P, that is, if it's a fact about which no one has ever had the power to change, and furthermore, it's an unalterable fact that Q necessarily follows from P, that is, that necessarily if P then Q, then it's also an unalterable fact that Q. That is, then it follows that no one has ever had the power to change Q either. We could sort of set this up as a little argument form. Essentially, what Van Inwagen is doing with the principle is telling us that we can validly conclude certain things from certain other things. So if we have as a premise, it's an unalterable fact that P, and we have as another premise, it's an unalterable fact that P necessitates Q, it validly follows, according to Van Inwagen, that it's an unalterable fact that Q. Let's swap in for P and Q just some toy examples before we bring this back and apply it to the consequence argument. Suppose it's an unalterable fact that nuclear fusion occurs in the sun. I mean, that seems like actually a good candidate for an unalterable fact. No one's ever had the power to change the fact that nuclear fusion occurs in the sun. Now add that it's an unalterable fact that nuclear fusions occurring in the sun necessitates that the sun produces light. That is, what's unalterable there is fusions guaranteeing the production of light. That's what we can't alter, that if fusion occurs in the sun, then it produces light. Then, since we can't alter the fact that nuclear fusion occurs in the sun, therefore it's an unalterable fact that the sun produces light. So that's an application of the unalterability principle using a couple of facts about which we have no power to change. Now we can come back to determinism and show that given determinism, it's going to follow that my choice to attend UCF, or let's say my decision to take Philosophy 2010, is an unalterable fact and therefore not free. Here's what Van Inwagen says. We can fill in the middle bits, C2, C3, and C4. He says this, but consider these two statements of fact. Things were thus and so 10 million years ago. Things were thus and so if things were thus and so 10 million years ago, then I'm now writing this book. We could substitute in if things were thus and so 10 million years ago, then I'm now taking Philosophy 2010. The facts expressed by these two statements are both untouchable or unalterable facts. No human being is able or ever has been able to do anything about the way the world was 10 million years ago, and no human being is able or ever will be or ever was able to do anything about the fact expressed by the second statement. For this statement is a consequence of the laws of nature, and no human being can do anything about what the laws of nature are or what their consequences are. So, that is his compressed statement of the premises of the consequence argument. We're going to start by assuming determinism's truth at premise 1, and then premise 2 is this. It's an unalterable fact that the state of the world in, let's pick a time a very long time ago, 10 million BCE or maybe 65 million BCE if we want there to be dinosaurs, sometime long before there were people. It's an unalterable fact that the state of the world in 10 million BCE was S, which, remember, we don't know all the details of what was going on in S, but there is or was such a state, and that the laws of nature are L1 through Ln, and those are just placeholders for whatever the completed sciences tell us the laws of nature are. So what the second premise says is that the state of the world long before there were humans and the laws of nature together are unalterable facts. And what that means is these are facts that no one has ever had the power to change. I've never had the power to change the fact that, 10 million years ago, the state of the world was S. That means I've never had the power to change, among other things, that there was a brontosaurus approaching a tree at that time. I wasn't born back then. Even if I was, I probably couldn't do anything to stop it. Nor do I have the power to change the fact that the laws of nature were what they were back then. Nor has any other human being. Now, let's add to that this third premise, C3. It's an unalterable fact that the state of the world S, which was that state of the world that included the brontosaurus approaching the tree in 65 million BCE, and laws L1 through Ln necessitate that I'm taking Philosophy 2010 right now. Okay, so what C3 says is it's an unalterable fact that the state of the world being S 65 million years ago and the laws of nature being what they were guarantee that I'm taking Philosophy 2010 right now. Here we have an assumption of determinism's truth. I mean, recall that what we're assuming is that the state of the world at any given time guarantees together with the laws of nature, guarantees a single unique future state of the world. And so, if determinism's true, the state of the world 65 million years ago guaranteed that you would take philosophy 2010 in the year 2024. Now, add to that, not only is that true given determinism, it's also the sort of thing that no one can change. I mean, I can't change determinism's truth. You can't change determinism's truth. In other words, that the state of the world 65 million years ago guarantees your taking philosophy 2010 right now is itself an unalterable fact. That is what's going on behind C3. It's an unalterable fact that the way things were 10 million years ago guarantee that here I am taking philosophy 2010. I can't change that fact if indeed determinism is true, nor can you. Now, let's apply the principle, or the unalterability principle. What we have here is C2. It's an unalterable fact that the state of the world 65 million years ago was S, and that the laws of nature were L1 through Ln. And also that it's an unalterable fact that things being that way necessitate that I'm taking philosophy 2010 right now, or have that as a necessary consequence. Apply principle, and what follows is therefore it's an unalterable fact that I'm taking philosophy 2010 right now. Just like it followed that it's an unalterable fact that the sun produces light, given that we assumed that it's an unalterable fact that nuclear fusion was occurring in the sun, and we assume that it's an unalterable fact that nuclear fusion is occurring produces light. It follows that the sun's producing light is an unalterable fact. Likewise, if we assume that it's an unalterable fact that the state of the world 10 million years ago was S and the laws of nature were what they were, and we also assume it's an unalterable fact that those things necessitate my taking philosophy 2010, then it follows that it's an unalterable fact that I'm taking philosophy 2010 now. Okay, so suppose we have gotten this far, that it's an unalterable fact that I'm taking philosophy 2010 right now. What does that have to do with free will? Recall that an unalterable fact is just by definition one that no one, including me, has ever had the ability or power to change. Given C4 then, I don't have the ability to do otherwise than take philosophy 2010. I have no power to change that fact, nor have I ever. Nor do you, taking philosophy 2010 right now. Why is that relevant to free will? Recall that a core necessary condition for someone to be free, as we discussed in a previous video, is the ability to do otherwise. This was what we called the AO condition. In order for me to be free, I have to be able to do other than what I actually do. To the extent that I don't have that ability, I'm more like somebody in a jail cell than I am like a free person. And so that's why it follows, C5, therefore I'm not taking philosophy 2010 of my own free will. If it's an unalterable fact that I'm taking philosophy 2010 right now, then I'm not doing so freely, because it means I have no power to do anything other than take it, which is a way of not being free. So that is why 5 follows from 4. It's via the AO condition. Let me back up for a second and just recap. Here's what we just did. We assumed that determinism is true for purposes of deducing from that assumption the conclusion that my taking philosophy 2010 is not free, or I didn't take philosophy 2010 of my own free will. The final conclusion here that is most important for Van Inwagen is, since determinism's truth implies that my taking philosophy 2010 wasn't free, we can now conclude that if determinism is true, then I'm not taking philosophy 2010 of my own free will. Now, we are awfully close at this point to completing the argument for incompatibilism. And incompatibilism is the view that if determinism is true, then no one has free will. Here's what Van Inwagen says. Obviously, the content of the particular example, his was writing the book, yours is taking philosophy 2010, played no role in the derivation of the conclusion. If determinism is true and the principle is correct, all facts are unalterable. It follows, given principle, that determinism implies there is no free will. For if anyone on any occasion has ever been able to act otherwise, then someone has been able to cause certain things to be different from the way they in fact are. And if anyone has ever had that ability, then some facts are not untouchable facts. So Van Inwagen notes, look, the reasoning that we just employed there, using You're Taking Philosophy 2010, could have been used with any other action of yours. Choosing to go to UCF, choosing your career, choosing to stop and help somebody who needed help, maybe some bad thing you did at some point. Any action that you've ever thought of as free was guaranteed or necessitated by the state of the world in the distant past, over which you have no control, nor does anyone else. It's an unalterable fact. And given determinism, that unalterable fact entailed or guaranteed that you would stop and help, that you would take Philosophy 2010, whatever your example is. So it follows that it's an unalterable fact that you made the decisions you did, which means that if determinism is true, then we have no free will. That is what we'll call the threat from determination to freedom.